They said the screams started before dawn, sharp, brittle sounds that cracked through the fog, like the bones of the earth itself breaking. By the time the first neighbor reached the house, the windows were painted black from the inside. No lights, no motion, only the smell, copper and ash, heavy and wet, like a slaughterhouse after rain. Inside, the walls were covered in something that looked like scripture, though no language any preacher could recognize. Every verse began and ended with the same 3 words: for the blood. On the kitchen table sat what looked like a wedding veil, still damp, torn clean down the middle. And beneath it, 2 rings fused together by heat, the metal warped like it had tried to escape its own shape. The fire hadn't come from outside. It had started from within. The hearth, the floorboards, the very air swollen with smoke that smelled not of wood, but of skin. They found her there, sitting upright in a chair facing the doorway, pale as marble, her hands folded in her lap as if waiting for a ceremony that never came. Her eyes were open, glassy, frozen wide, and inside each pupil was the faint reflection of something still burning. No one ever found the man. Just the imprint of his body, scorched into the floorboards beside her. The outline of a figure that had been there long enough to burn through oak. The sheriff said it was lightning. The coroner said it was madness. But the locals, the ones who remembered the family name and whispered it only at funerals, they said something else. She called him brother. The story was buried before it ever made the papers. The house was razed, the soil salted, the records sealed under domestic tragedy, but the land never forgot, even now. If you walk that hollow near the Tennessee line, you can still hear humming beneath the ground. A single, broken note that sounds like grief made into sound. A melody passed through generations, through womb and grave, through blood that refused to thin. And if you stand long enough in the fog, it begins to hum back at you. But which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? The land around that burned house was never plowed again. Even cattle refused to graze near it. The soil there was gray, not from ash, but from something deeper. Something that had seeped through the roots, into the stones, and stayed. They called it the hollow that hums. Maps no longer mark it. But old men at the diner still draw its shape in spilled coffee. A crooked patch of hills west of Centerville, Tennessee. A place that never healed. In the archives of Hickman County, there's a single remaining ledger from 1899. Its pages are brittle, its ink half eaten by mold, but one entry is still legible. License issued. Almeida Whitlock and Isaiah Whitlock, union by blood. The clerk who wrote it added no notes. He didn't have to. In towns like this, words like by blood carry their own scripture. No one talks about what came after the fire, but before it. Before the house turned to smoke. The Whitlocks were something close to royalty in those hills. Landowners, God-fearing, proud to the point of blindness. They lived on the edge of civilization and worshipped their own reflection. To outsiders, they were reclusive. To themselves, they were chosen. The family name reached back to the 1820s. Tobacco growers turned preachers turned prophets. Each generation buried the last behind the same barn, marked with nothing but initials carved into soft wood. Their sermons were never written, their prayers never shared. But every child learned the same commandment: keep the blood clean. By the time the century turned, the last branch of that line lived in a house that smelled of mildew and scripture. Its walls were swollen with dampness. Its doors always bolted from the inside. Passers-by said they could hear chanting on certain nights, though no church bells ever rang. They said the Whitlocks didn't sleep. They waited. When the census men came in 1900, they found 9 people listed under the same roof. But of those 9, only 7 were ever seen in town. The others, the last 2, were never mentioned again. And among those who were seen, there was a girl, 22 years old, pale, quiet, always holding a white handkerchief like it was a relic. Her name was Almeida. She smiled when spoken to, but her eyes never moved. Her story begins where all cursed bloodlines do, at the altar. It was June 3rd, 1901, when Almeida Whitlock walked down an aisle built not of stone or faith, but of obligation. There were no candles, no flowers, just the creak of rotting boards beneath her bare feet, and the smell of sweat, mildew, and something metallic that lingered in the air, like the scent of rusted tools after rain. The ceremony took place in the Whitlock parlor, a room too small to hold the weight of what was happening. 12 family members stood as witnesses. None spoke, none smiled. Their faces looked carved from the same wood that held the house together, pale, splintered, ready to crack. At the front of the room stood Eli Whitlock, Almeida's father, preacher, patriarch, and architect of the curse. His Bible was missing half its pages, the verses rewritten by his own hand. He had spent decades twisting scripture until it justified his desires. When he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, rehearsed. The Lord keeps his blood pure. Beside him stood the groom, Isaiah, her twin. Their resemblance was haunting. The same dark hair, the same thin lips, the same eyes that never blinked at the same time. They looked like reflections that had learned to move independently. When Eli told them to join hands, neither hesitated. They had rehearsed this too, every glance, every vow, every surrender. The neighbors who came, mostly distant cousins, said the air that day felt wrong, too still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Some whispered that they saw shapes in the corner of the room, outlines of children who were not there, watching from between the cracks in the walls. When the vows were spoken, Almeida's voice trembled only once, not from fear, but from something deeper, something that had been drilled into her since childhood. She was not marrying a man. She was fulfilling a commandment. The kiss was brief, mechanical, performed like a ritual without faith. Afterward, Eli closed his Bible, pressed it against their joined hands and said, "The seed will not stray." That night, as the guests left, no one dared to look back at the house. But one neighbor swore that, as he walked away, he heard a faint lullaby coming from inside, not sung but hummed, low and steady, the same note over and over, like a prayer that never ended. It would be heard again, years later, from the throats of their children. After the wedding, Almeida never left the property again. The house became her horizon, its windows her sky, its walls her scripture. Time inside moved differently. Days bled into nights, and nights into something colder, quieter. The seasons changed outside, but inside, everything stayed the same. The smell of damp wood, the hum of insects trapped between window panes, the slow, constant creak of the rocking chair in the corner that no one ever sat in. Isaiah took his father's words as law. What Eli had called purity, he called destiny. He no longer looked at his sister as blood, but as continuation. He told her often, "We are the last, and that makes us chosen." His hands trembled when he said it, not from fear, from hunger, the kind that doesn't fade when fed. Eli watched from the shadows of his study, his Bible open, his pen scratching at the margins, rewriting God again and again until it sounded like him. His sermons no longer mentioned heaven, only lineage, only blood. When the first child came, the birth was quiet. No cries, no screams, just silence and a smell, sweet, sour, metallic. The midwife, an old woman from 2 ridges over, was summoned under threat of a shotgun. She delivered the baby by lamplight, then went still. The child didn't cry. Its eyes opened first, too large, too knowing, and then it smiled. Not the way babies do, not with joy, but with recognition. By morning, the child was gone. Eli said it had been returned to the earth. He buried it himself behind the barn, in the same soil that had swallowed generations before. Almeida watched from the porch, her face blank, her fingers digging into her own wrists, as if trying to wake herself from a dream she couldn't leave. A year later, it happened again. Another child. This one lived. His name was Levi. He didn't make a sound for the first 3 years of his life. Not laughter, not crying. Just that same low hum. Constant and wordless, echoing through the house like something older than language. Eli said it was the song of the bloodline. Isaiah said it was proof of their purity. But Almeida, she knew better. That sound wasn't song. It was warning. It was what grief sounds like when it learns to breathe. And at night, when everyone else slept, she could hear Levi whispering to someone who wasn't there. Always the same word, over and over. Mother. By the time Levi turned 6, the Whitlock house had gone completely silent. The kind of silence that bends the air, heavy enough to press on the lungs. Almeida no longer spoke except in prayer, though no one was sure what God she prayed to anymore. Isaiah spent his days in the orchard, splitting wood that no one burned, muttering scripture that didn't exist. And Eli, old now, his mind slipping between prophecy and madness, began carving words into the walls with a pocket knife, words he said would keep the blood awake. Levi watched him from the stairs, humming that same note over and over, until even the birds stopped nesting near the roof. He'd begun drawing things, too, on the walls, on the floor, even on his own skin. Circles, eyes, branches that grew back into themselves. When Almeida tried to wash them off, he screamed, not like a child, but like something that remembered pain. That winter, the ground froze hard. The orchard turned black. One night a storm rolled through, not thunder, but a low rumble that felt like it came from the soil itself. The next morning, Almeida found Levi in the yard, barefoot, digging holes behind the barn. Not wide, not shallow, narrow and deep, 6 feet, always 6. When she asked why, he said, in a voice too calm for a child, because they're waiting. Eli didn't stop him. He only smiled. The boy has instinct, he said, the way a farmer might speak of a well-trained hound. And from that day on, the holes remained. Not graves, not yet, but promises. At night the humming spread, first from Levi's room, then from the floorboards, then from the very walls. It was faint, but constant, like the vibration of bees trapped in wood. Almeida pressed her ear to the floor once, desperate to understand. What she heard wasn't humming anymore. It was voices. Dozens, whispering in time. A family choir beneath the earth. Isaiah began sleeping outside after that, under the porch. He said the air in the house was too thick to breathe. But even there, the sound followed him, rising through the ground like steam. Sometimes, when the moon hung low over the ridge, he'd wake to find Levi standing in the yard, staring at him, his lips moving, no sound escaping, just the shape of a word repeated again and again. Brother. By 1909, the orchard was nothing but skeleton trees. Gray, bark peeled, roots half exposed like bones pushing through thin skin. Almeida stopped tending to it. She barely slept. She said the trees whispered her name now, in the same broken voice that had once belonged to her father. Eli Whitlock had grown so old his face looked carved from wax. He spent his nights in the parlor, reading from his rewritten Bible, the ink smeared from years of trembling hands. Sometimes he'd look at Levi, now 10, and smile with a kind of reverence that terrified everyone else. "He is the vessel," Eli said, "the last of the promise." That autumn, Livy began walking the halls at night. The boards creaked in a rhythm, slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat made of wood. Almeida would wake to find him standing at the foot of her bed, hair dripping with sweat though the nights had turned cold. She'd whisper his name, but he never answered, only tilted his head, listening to something she couldn't hear. Then came the night of the quake. Not from the sky, but from below. The first tremor hit just after midnight. The walls groaned. Dust fell from the ceiling like ash. Then, silence. Isaiah burst into Almeida's room, his face pale, eyes wild. "The ground's moving," he said. But she already knew. She could feel it beneath her feet. The same hum that had haunted the house for years, now pulsing stronger, deeper, like a heartbeat returning after years of stillness. Outside, the orchard was shifting. The earth buckled, as if something beneath it was trying to breathe. The holes Levi had dug were gone, swallowed by the soil, closed over. And standing in the center of it all was the boy himself, his arms outstretched, his eyes rolled white toward the sky. Eli stumbled out behind them, clutching his Bible, shouting words that didn't belong to any language, syllables that scraped the air raw. "He's calling them home," he screamed. The line remembers. The ground split then, not wide, but long, slicing straight through the orchard. From within came the sound of rushing air, not wind, but breath. Something exhaling after a century of waiting. Levi fell to his knees, his humming now a scream, a single, unbroken note that made the windows shatter. Almeida ran to him, grabbing his face, shouting his name. But when he looked at her, it wasn't him anymore. His eyes were black from corner to corner, his mouth trembling as if another voice was trying to crawl out. And then it spoke, not in the voice of a child, not in any human tongue, but in the same low, humming tone that had haunted their bloodline for generations. The sound of a name being remembered after too long buried. When morning came, the orchard was still. The ground sealed itself. Eli was gone. Isaiah would not speak. And Almeida, she sat in the dirt, cradling Levi's body, her lips moving soundlessly, whispering a lullaby no one else could hear. They said the Whitlock blood ended that night. But the neighbors still swear that when the fog rolls in from the ridge, you can hear it, the hum, deep, slow, patient. Like something beneath the earth still waiting to be born again. Years passed. The Whitlock farmhouse sank into itself, roof caved, windows hollowed, vines swallowing the porch until the house looked less built than grown. The orchard turned wild, fruitless, its branches twisted like hands reaching for something long gone. But the earth never truly settled. Locals avoided that ridge entirely. Hunters said their dogs refused to cross the fence line. At night, the mist there was thicker, not the clean, cold kind, but heavy, sour, alive. And sometimes, beneath the chorus of cicadas, you could hear a hum, faint, but constant, rising and falling like the sound of a distant hive. They said the Whitlocks were all gone, that the last of them, Almeida, had been found years later, sitting on the porch in her wedding dress, blind and smiling, as if she'd been waiting for someone who never came. The coroner wrote, natural causes, though no one who saw her eyes believed that. But something remained. In 1924, a survey crew came through the valley, clearing old ground for a new railway. One of them, a young man named Joseph Crane, kept a journal. The first week, he wrote about weather, wildlife, Soul quality, then the tone changed. June 17th. We found something under the old orchard. Roots, but not roots. Too symmetrical. The men think it's bone. June 18th. We dug deeper. Found small hollows, like the earth was hollowing itself around something. A smell came out, like copper and rainwater. The foreman says to keep quiet. June 19th. At night, the ground hums. I can feel it through my boots. That was his last entry. The crew left the next day. No railway was ever built. Decades later, children in the nearby town would dare each other to visit the Whitlock ruins. None stayed long. They said the air there felt wrong, too warm, even in winter, and if you stood still long enough, the dirt beneath your shoes would move, just slightly, as if breathing. One boy, years later, as a grown man, swore that he saw something once. Small, fragile, crawling from a crack in the soil, pale as milk, hair black as wet bark. Its mouth opened but no sound came out, only the hum. The same low, endless hum. He never went back. And now, when the valley floods and the old soil softens, bones rise with the water. Bones too small, too smooth, too perfect. The townsfolk bury them quietly. They don't speak the name anymore. Because the Whitlocks were never just a family. They were a root system. One that didn't end when the tree fell. A seed that learned to sleep. And every century or so, when the ground grows warm and the fog drifts low across the orchard, you can still hear the song of their bloodline. A single hum beneath the world, steady, waiting, alive.